Good evening, everyone. Welcome here to the Convention Centre. My name's Connie Lenneberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, and I have the great pleasure of being your MC for this evening. So on behalf of La Trobe University, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this first session of Ideas in Society for 2018. The idea of the concept for Ideas in Society is to engage in conversation with some of Australia's leading thinkers and social activists to bring their respected voices to thoughts about how Australia can be a more just and compassionate society. So, a better Australia, ? What do we need to do to be that better Australia in the future? Before we commence, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to acknowledge and to give my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome some of our esteemed colleagues that are joining us here tonight. So Professor Robert Mann, who has convened the Ideas in Society program for the past 9 years. The Parliamentary Secretary for Major Events in Regional Victoria, as well as Member for Yan Yean, Danielle Green. The La Trobe University Acting Vice-Chancellor, Professor Keith Nugent, and La Trobe's Chief of Staff, Mr Leon Morris. We live at a time when our region and the world seems really burdened by many heartbreaking events, and we know that this last weekend has seen the anniversary of one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes of this millennium so far, which is the Syria crisis. It's the 7th anniversary since that war began, and in that time we've seen possibly 500,000 people at least killed. We've seen 5.5 million people flee into surrounding countries and further afield in the search for safety. We know that there's inside Syria 6.1 million people who have been internally displaced by the conflict, many of them displaced several times. And we know that there's also something like 13 million people in desperate need. And you've seen these images on your television. These are people who don't have access to the basics of water, let alone clean water, food, shelter in freezing winters and burning summers, and who are finding themselves trapped, besieged in areas of violent conflict where bombs are dropping every day and where there are many combatants. And we see that, and that's probably sort of the strongest image that we can take when we think about the world today. Closer to home, we see the Rohingya crisis, and the UNHCR estimates that by January this year, 700,000 Rohingya people had fled across the border from Myanmar into Bangladesh. And there too, the world is wondering what to do as the environmental situation and as the conditions that they face are dire and very dangerous for human survival. So what's our role as Australia? What's Australia's role as a wealthy nation in the world today, ranked as number 4 on the Human Development Index? What's our role in terms of compassion and justice to reach out to and respond to the needs that we see all around us in the world today? We've got a conversation today between two men that really need no introduction, the Reverend Tim Costello and John Faine. So we know Tim is one of our national treasures in Australia, one of the 100 national treasures. He's one of our best-known community leaders and a sought-after voice on social justice issues and ethics. He's devoted his life to searching for solutions to practical problems, from his time as the Mayor of St Kilda through to now working with World Vision over the last 12 years as the Chief Executive Officer of World Vision Australia, the last 2 years as the Chief Advocate for World Vision in Australia, as well as now the Executive Director of MICA Australia. You know that he has many interests that he pursues on the social justice agenda, but he is one of our foremost speakers and thinkers, looking at how you provide hope to thinking about international issues going forward. Also, John Faine is a very well-known broadcaster in our country. He's highly regarded for his professionalism, fair-mindedness, and the way in which he engages with all manner of interviewees across his program now, and he's become part of the democratic architecture of our state. So please welcome John Faine, democratic architecture and national treasure, to share with us here today as they provide some reflection on a better Australia.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Connie. And I sit here with the rare distinction that in the last week I've had a formal complaint to the ABC made about my conduct by both Richard Di Natale and Peter Dutton. And to get the two of them in the same week I think is pretty special. Tim, as Connie reminded us, the world's in a very volatile state of flux at the moment. Indeed, I think it's a bit of a mess. We've got 50 minutes to fix it. Where do you want to start?
Well, let me start with Connie. So Connie has worked for World Vision for the last 20 years and overseeing the easy places, Gaza, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Connie and I have gone into those places, and she was the one, and I've written about this in a book called Hope, who taught me that it's actually the women who are going to fix the world, not the men. There we were responding in Pakistan 6 months after the tsunami, where 180,000 died up in the northwest, where Osama bin Laden was recruiting. I was with the men, Connie was with the women. World Vision, one of the few agencies that responded. Virtually impossible to raise $1 after we'd raised $120 million for the tsunami because they're Muslim and they're up there, but an earthquake and terrible suffering. I met Connie after our various meetings, gender divided, and I said, oh, they love us. Look at all the presents I've got. Look at the wonderful way we put in the wells, and we've done a great job. And Connie said, no, we haven't. We've done a crap job. And I said, what? Look, they've been thanking me. She said, I've been with the women. Because it's a patriarchal society, they're the gatekeepers, the men, so we asked them where you want the wells. In fact, we've put all the wells and the water in the wrong areas. Those men, Connie reminded me, have never carried a drop of water in their lives. They have no idea what they actually needed. And it was a very early salutary lesson to me that the mess, and we can talk about a lot of areas, really has to be focused on empowering women and them being in leadership.
When I visited Pakistan after the flood, and I was out of Multan and heading up towards, in the Punjab, up to the valley of the flooded rivers, we went to one community where there was a field hospital and there were kids dying in front of my eyes, and I wept openly and couldn't control my emotions, and they all looked at me and thought I was a bit soft. They're used to it. And then I noticed that if there were, I think, 10 beds in a row and there were 10 kids dying, they were all girls. And so I asked the doctor from UNICEF, why was there somewhere else for the boys? And he said, no, it's all the girls who die. The families will save the boys and let the girls die. So if you think it's up to the women in these communities, there's a lot to be done to turn around from the way they see the world to the way we see the world, is there not?
Yeah, well, we know in the Liberal Party, I think there's 13 women out of 76 representatives, so there's a bit to be done here too. Look,
I don't think they let them die quite at the same rate.
No, but the truth is that our microfinance loans, we have nearly $1 billion in rolling capital. They go to women. Why? Because for every dollar a woman earns, 90 cents flows to the kids. For every dollar a man earns on average, 40 cents flows to the kids. Even in poverty, men find a way to gamble or drink or waste the money. We know that every year you keep a girl in school, it's something like 1.2 less children they have. You know that backing women is fundamental for development, whatever country we're talking about.
So aid is revolutionary. How should the Australian government address then that very aspiration? We have, what targets do we have? What priorities do we set? How cohesive is our planning?
Yeah, well, the Australian aid program is a very sad story at the moment. In terms of levels of aid, we're at our lowest level ever, 22 cents of $100 of gross national income, highest under Bob Menzies, when it was 51 cents. We have cut 11 billion Abbott and Hockey budget over 4 years, and it is terrible. The promise, of course, was 70 cents in $100 of gross national income. The Brits have legislated that. David Cameron famously said, under pressure, 85% public debt the British government had, we're at about 20%. He said, despite the pressure to cut aid, we won't balance the books on the backs of the poor. And the Scandinavians, the Dutch, have kept their promise of 70 cents. We've given ourselves a leave pass. Look, within the actual aid program, certainly Julie Bishop has said, let's focus on women. If you actually look at it in detail, whilst not-for-profits haven't been cut, the big dollars, not-for-profits get, World Vision gets about 10% of the monies we raise, but it's under about 11% overall not-for-profits get in aid. It's private contractors and it's businesses. And they have a job to do. World Vision and others can't build bridges and infrastructure, and there's a reason you have, but it's not weighted in the right way. And really the retreat on aid, and we'll get, I'm sure, to climate change, but it's the same sort of idea going. With climate change, the denialists say climate change is natural, it's not human-made. With poverty, the retreat of countries is saying poverty is natural, it's not created. If it's created by humans, it can be uncreated. We can actually change rules and increase aid and have better trade. So yes, there's been a focus on women, but in a much reduced aid program.
So is there the prospect that things like foreign aid and targeted programs for foreign aid will be ever anything other than a political football?
Well, we've seen in Scandinavian, Dutch and British countries, yes. Aid was always bipartisan. Where it started was a Canadian Foreign Minister, Lester Pearman, who in the 60s said... Pearson, sorry.
Yes.
Thank you. That's why you're good. He said...
Together with Doc Evatt, the architect of the United Nations.
Indeed.
Yeah, remarkable man.
He said, let rich countries give 1% of their gross national income to the world's poor because inequality actually threatens all of us. He said 70 cents, or 70%, 0.7 of that 1% comes from government, 0.3 comes from private giving. What we've seen is many in private giving in countries keep their promise, but Australia's never kept its promise there, and now it's at its lowest level ever. But there are exceptions which have actually kept alive the fact that even in countries with nasty neighbours, with nothing to sell, with chronic poverty, landlocked countries, aid has profoundly changed maternal deaths, infant deaths, the number of kids dying of malaria. Trade is certainly a big engine that's driven the lifting of people out of poverty, and the overall figure is that when I started at World Vision, it was 30,000 kids each day dying under the age of 5 from stupid poverty, dirty water. We know how to do clean water, so it's stupid. Malaria, we know insecticide-treated malaria nets are not getting enough calories. Today, it's less than 16,000 kids that died under the age of 5 from dirty water, from stupid poverty. We have made great progress. But we're starting now to lose those gains as we turn inwards, the re-tribalising, I call it, the old gods of blood and soil saying we'll just look after ourselves. If I had $1 for every time an Australian says, we've got homeless, we're not going to send money over there. But that is what we're doing. It's not what a number of countries necessarily are doing.
Did anyone suggest as a sort of solution or an answer to the plight of persecuted white farmers in South Africa that a lifeboat to Australia was perhaps an option in some people's mind, but an increase in aid to impoverished parts of Southern Africa might also? be a solution?
No one I heard suggested that. No one even suggested what I think is a more obvious thing. I never justify violence, but I know that those black workers on white South African farms are being paid $5 a day. And if the farmers were here, they'd be paying $22 an hour for their workers. South Africa is the only country, and I talk to my agricultural friends here, who says, we don't need to mechanise, we will never have a labour shortage. Just about everywhere else, including China, in agriculture is saying we've got a labour shortage. It's unbelievable, but they're actually saying we can't find people to do that work. South Africa isn't, because they're paying people so little. Now, maybe our first step was to actually pay people a reasonable amount, because that will take some of the heat out of the rich, maybe white farmers. So whether it's aid, whether it's justice, absolutely they are solutions before bring them here.
But it's the same, is it not, as the microcosm of the refugee debate? And when you talk to the hardheads behind the scenes of any of our major political parties, they say, well, being tough on refugees plays well in Western Sydney and rural Queensland. There's a lot of marginal seats. That's where government's determined. It doesn't matter what goes on in the inner north of Melbourne or wherever it might be. It's irrelevant. Now, aid is exactly the same, is it not? When aid and an increase in the aid budget will deliver marginal seats in Western Sydney and Queensland, then aid will get the sort of attention and focus that you would like. But until then, where are we?
So the whole reason right from the beginning aid was to be bipartisan, was to avoid this situation. We know whether it's the race card or the refugee or the sense of if you increase aid, maybe that money's not going on my local school or hospital, leads to a spiral to the bottom. And that's exactly what we've seen happen with the breaking of bipartisanship on aid. It's why civilised nations, so it wasn't just the Tories, it was backed by Labor, legislated in the UK 0.7%. We've known for a long time, Richard Nixon said it most eloquently, there ain't no votes in aid. And we have known that if you're going to deal with international problems, and the world is a waterbed, you press down here, it comes up here. Whether it's climate change, whether it's refugees, whether it's mass poverty, and what the ripple effect of that is, that you have to have a bipartisan, locked-in sense of leadership that says, we won't play politics with that. Now, that's exactly what we've done in this country.
Can you see it ever turning around now? Can you see us returning to a bipartisan approach?
Well, I keep on hoping and praying.
That's not on its own going to necessarily achieve it.
I think that this goes to the issue I suspect lots in this room feel about principled leadership, and when are we going to recognise that a United Nations system, which at the end of the day can only be organised on national sovereignty, and what's in it for me, actually can't solve the issues that are now requiring international cooperation, not international competition. Now, we have to have leaders that effectively go, actually, the national levers can't solve the problems. We've got to find a way to cooperate on the big issues. That's the leadership we need.
I was saving up leadership for later. Riddle me this. I don't understand, I've never understood. There are disasters, national disasters, terrible things that happen that do connect with the Australian public, and there are others that the Australian public just doesn't care about. We run appeals at the ABC. Sometimes we're overwhelmed with the generosity, whether it was the earthquake in New Guinea or problems in Indonesia when there was the tsunami there. The response was extraordinary. On the other hand, we've run appeals where we've hardly raised a fraction of our target. What is it that sometimes resonates, but other times the Australian public just go, don't care?
So in my experience, it's a pretty simple reason. We are wired as humans to respond to what we call innocent suffering. Innocent suffering is where we say, that could be me. A tsunami, as a coastal people in Australia, that could be us. An earthquake, that could be us. A volcano, that could be us. Where it's not innocent suffering is where it's war. Well, they should just stop fighting. Where the Rohingyas, take that as an example. Where it's human malevolence, that's actually their problem.
But the little Syrian boy whose name, shamefully, I can't remember,
Alan Kurdi, yeah.
who was carried out of the water on a Turkish island after the dreadful Putin and Assad created crisis in the Middle East. Everyone related to that. So that tugged at the heartstrings.
Only years after, we had all turned our backs really on Syria because of conflict. So Alan Kurdi was a remarkable moment that broke through impenetrable indifference up to that point, John. And was it the Madonna image still in our Judeo-Christian, the limp body, being held? Was it that sense that could be my child? And sadly, despite Alan Kurdi's breakthrough for a moment, we went back to our indifference because it's Sunni Shia, Iran versus Saudi Arabia proxy war. That's really what it is, that the United Nations, frankly, could and should have settled within 12 months, only because the great powers had the illusion their side can win. Us, Obama, Saudi Arabia backing the rebels, Russia, Iran backing Assad, funneling weapons, funneling money as this war continued because it's a proxy war on. But the indifference on that is the main story. Alan Kurdi was this momentary blip and we went back to our indifference.
I'm not wanting to be controversial, but I'm going to be anyway. But I'm not going to spare you here or your sector. From my end of the funnel, sometimes I think that the welfare agencies and the charities are really lazy in telling their stories. And there's compelling stories. I've seen them myself. I've been to refugee camps in various continents and various conflicts. But you trot out the same story and the same narrative and the same images over and over and again, and inevitably people become hardened. We suffer the compassion fatigue is the label given to it, but people don't react. I mean, maybe the challenge is that you guys need to tell better stories and get through to us in new ways.
So the tsunami saw this wave of generosity from Australians, largely for one reason: Australians died. Pakistan, which I started with in Connie, 6 months later, 160,000, there was no foreigners that died. The story has changed to our credit because we know it still works, that if you show the most desperate pictures of desperate kids, which is utterly undignified and dehumanising to them, it actually works. Mm-hmm. But we, as a sector, said that is wrong. If we are on about their dignity, we have to stop doing it, to our own fundraising detriment.
Yep.
There are some organisations, won't name them, that actually have broken with the code and are raising more dollars.
Is that unethical?
Yep, I think it's unethical. But, look, this is where the ethics get really tricky. So the first question anyone asks me is, what are your overheads? And I'm going to give to the organisation with the lowest overheads.
Yep.
I sometimes say to them, if my wife was ill and I needed a doctor, would I start ringing medical clinics and as my first question say, what's the overheads of this medical clinic? Mm-hmm. And then choose the one with the lowest overheads. Mm. Or would I say, what's the survival rate of patients with these symptoms? I don't actually care what the overheads are. Secondly, I've said to people, I could raise some serious money for Syria, let's say $10 million, and it's desperate there, but I'd need to spend $5 million to do it. Should I do it? People say, yep, we think you should do it. Then I say, you just gave me permission for 50% overhead. They say, oh no, you can't do that. That's wrong. In other words, the overhead is a measure of efficiency, but not of effectiveness. The desperate stories are effective for raising dollars, efficient for raising dollars. But in terms of dignity, of what we're actually saying about our fellow humans, they're not effective in the long run, because they have to have more and more desperate stories, and that, if I can call it, sugar hit.
Let's go back. Red Cross got into trouble with the Bali appeal. Oxfam have just been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons over some revelations to do with Haiti. Your sector's not immune from the phenomenon now that the gatekeepers of the media are gone, and anyone in this room is a storyteller. Anyone in this room can find something out, put it on the internet, and before you know it, sometimes it's taken off and it's viral. How do you adapt? How does your organisation adapt in order to reinforce the good part and minimise the risks of any bad bits?
Well, funnily enough, that again goes to the overhead discussion. So,
but it's bigger than that too, isn't it?
It's bigger, but most of us have put in very strict protocols, from police checks to intensive child protection measures and training, which actually is an overhead, to due diligence in who you employ and any history or question mark over them when they're in a stressful situation, which actually is an overhead. So when you have the pressure saying cut overheads, people often don't actually understand.
Regulation and accountability costs money.
This costs money, and this can lead to some of the very notable outages that do brand damage that is extraordinary and lasting. Look, at the end of the day, people are very happy to find a leave pass for why they won't give, for why they'll say no. I hope people in this audience and Australians don't, because we actually still are incredibly blessed and lose perspective when we don't see how we're blessed. But to go to your question, NGOs are very frail human organisations. We are sending people into country where DFAT is ordering every Australian out. And Connie's done this time and again over 20 years, I've done it, where you actually see things you never really recover from. I can find myself back in Australia in a setting, giving a speech unrelated to World Vision, a happy occasion, and suddenly I'm in tears.
You can't unsee it. No.
And I don't know where it's come from.
Yep.
You build compartments around your world, because you know if you're talking to Australians about what you've seen, they'll listen for a while, their eyes will glaze over and they'll go, who's playing in the footy tonight? And those compartments that you build around you leak, and they surprise you and they undo you. We choose to do it. We're not saying we're heroes, but we actually are saying to the Australian public on your behalf, and Australians are pretty good like this. They actually roll up their sleeves. You see it in bushfire, you see it in flood. They say, we want to be there. And wasn't the community fantastic when we had a bushfire? Why can't we be like this all the time? So we have a disproportionate number of Australians who serve in international charities, because unlike other cultures that are very ideological, we are pragmatic. We are problem solvers. We are, and not just being patriotic, we are people who actually say we will find a way through. If it's not this way, we'll have a go here. And I'm very proud of that disproportionate Australian representation.
Do you think we're subliminally racist in our responses sometimes?
Look, I think subliminally racism is always with us, and it's with me. I find that I'm more interested still in the news, in what happens sometimes to Australians and certainly my staff, than the suffering of those around where that disaster might be. When I talk about the old gods of blood and soil, I mean that seriously. I think those old gods never went away. The old god of blood leads to racism. The god of soil leads to nationalism. I often reflect how Trump powerfully picked up the Rust Belt and the middle-class pain in America. Then what did he do with it? He said, I'll tell you why you're in pain. It's Mexicans, we'll build a wall. It's Chinese manipulating. It's Muslims, we'll ban them. And it powerfully works. And we know in history, when you connect someone's pain to a scapegoat, where in the worst situations this can lead. Because that nationalism soil, blood I'm calling, that racism is always there. And at Hamburg, the G20 last year, I was there, Erdogan saying we'll overcome the humiliation of the Ottoman Empire and Turkey, Mother Russia will be great again, Putin, Trump, let's make America great. It really struck me powerfully there. You would never hear a German chancellor say, let's make America great again. Let's make Germany great again.
But you know, in my travels, I've been in Mongolia and seen banners about making Mongolia great again. We used to have a great empire. The Thais say we used to have a great empire and we governed over half of Southeast Asia. I mean, you go to Kyrgyzstan, you go to Uzbekistan, you go anywhere and they say we used to be a great people. It's a theme throughout this modern world where the great paradox, we're more connected than ever before, but we're putting up more barriers, it seems, than ever before.
So the fundamental question I've never worked out about myself, and I'm a mystery to myself, is I do need identity. I need that sense of belonging. I need my footy colours on, and I love the tribe. Yeah, thank you. Actually, I'm declaring the Essendon peptide strategy a success. I think we've blooded new players. Anyway.
It's inevitable, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? You can't have a gathering of more than 100 people in Melbourne and not end up talking about football.
So I do need that belonging. Humans actually need it. Yet I also know that unless I can think of myself as no better and no superior to anyone else, isn't that what universal, indivisible human rights mean? And therefore my passion is for those parents who drew the lottery, the last ticket in the lottery of latitude. They were born in East Timor, my kids were born here, clean water, universal health. I know I didn't choose the stage of life I was thrown up on, or my parents. They didn't either, unless I can actually go, I could understand the moral panic of them not being able to get their kids' education or clean water. What would that feel like? If I close off that empathy, I think I am less than human. And, you know, my motto's sort of been, it's a faith motto, but it's a wider motto, to be committed at the core, so I need identity, and to be open at the edges. And I think that is the dance and the dialectic that we all find difficult.
We've just had an ASEAN meeting in Sydney. Our Prime Minister has been sitting in dialogue with all the regional leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi. So, what do you think, if anything, would have been put on the table by Australia, and what do you think should have been put on the table by Australia about the Rohingya crisis?
Well, I was encouraged to read that President Jokowi was going to put the Rohingya on the table. I do not know whether Australia raised it, and if they didn't, I would be pretty disappointed about that. So I certainly know Australia has taken the idea, we'll let the Americans, Rex Tillerson, before he had the exit button pushed on him, had called it genocide and ethnic cleansing. Julie Bishop's attitude was, we'll let the Americans do that upfront stuff, which is an interesting choice, and we will work a little bit on the economic and the soft diplomacy. Now, I'm not a geopolitical architect. If there was a strategy about where the pressure comes from, that might parallel tracks, that might be good. But for me, an Australia that can't talk about human rights in our region and has Rohingya still up in Manus, where I was at the end of October, early November, that suddenly is flicking the switch to white South African farmers. Not to put that on the agenda and have a discussion would be intolerable for me as an Australian.
We've got a federal election within the next 12 months. Either later this year or early next year is what the expectation of most pundits is. Do you think these issues will even rate a mention in a federal Australian election?
I was really encouraged that at last Wednesday in the Thornbury Theatre we would have had 500, 600 people out for an Australian aid discussion with Alex and Jed, the Green and the...
Alex Patel and Jed Carney, the two lead candidates. The
two lead candidates with great energy in the room, and both those women did really well. Now, Could that, and does that only happen in Batman? Does it only happen in a by-election, that you actually have energy around us being an international citizen, saying we've trashed our record with our very cruel refugee processing, and we've, in my view, a paralysing toxic debate for nearly 15 years. I think we've done damage to the Australian soul, to the sense of who actually we are. Now, that was a terrific and a mature discussion. Look, I still hope that there will be sections of the community who say, why don't we take the New Zealand option? They've put 150 on the table. Why do we think all the boats will start again when we know turn back is working, when we know that it is studied cruelty, and Robert Mann has written very eloquently about this, where the group think in Canberra that says the 5 planks, if we weakened one of those, then all the boats start again. So we can actually do studied cruel things to people on our watch. On our watch. How has that become possible?
Not only possible, the government boasts about it, as did the opposition when they were in power.
Indeed. And
they try and outdo each other.
This is very distressing for me. You know, I'm going to the Labor Party conference in Adelaide and I'm raising my voice again.
What reception do you think you'll get this time?
I don't know. Look, I
you were in Manus, late last year?
Yep.
You knew a lot before you got there. How did it compare with your expectations?
It profoundly shook me, not because Manus conditions are anything like the refugee camps I go to. I describe Cox's Bazaar and the Rohingya as walking through the gates of hell. 100% humidity, 40-degree heat. Black plastic is what they've used to build their radiating heat in unbelievable congestion with no trees. It was just hell. It's not like Uganda's refugee camps, where after 1 million in the last year have come from South Sudan. They haven't closed the borders. They give the South Sudanese 30 by 30 metres land. World Vision gives them utensils to grow vegetables, put up their houses, and they go to Ugandan schools and health clinics, overwhelmed and poor as they are. And you ask the Ugandan authorities why they haven't closed the border. They say, because we once were refugees under Idi Amin. And you go, wow, empathy. Manus shocked me, not because the conditions were like that, but because the sense of despair and hopelessness was worse than South Sudan and even Cox's Bazaar. That's what really shocked me. That senselessness, and interminable nature of it, and the crushing of hope. Now, a little bit of hope just with a few that have been accepted under the Turnbull Obama, now Turnbull Trump deal, but the sheer hopelessness of it, on my watch, as an Australian, was what was personally devastating.
And yet there's hundreds of thousands of people along the Turkey-Syria border. There's hundreds of thousands of people on the Syria-Jordan border. There are Palestinians displaced in the 1948 Israeli War of Independence who have never been relocated. I've never been to the Gaza Strip, but I've never heard a good thing said about it. How does that compare?
So, yeah, Gaza, where I have been, and Connie, you've been a number of times, is very dispiriting. It's an open-air prison. I think President Sarkozy described it best saying that. And you have a sense of despair there, but you have agency still there. In most of the places that you just described, bad as they are, you still have a sense of agency. What I saw on Manus...
What do you mean by that?
On Manus, the loss of agency is this sense that it is not moving anywhere. So when they barricaded themselves in on the naval base, and I was there when they were forcibly removed, talking to them, they said, this is the first time when we barricaded ourselves in, we took control of our life and had a sense of agency. That's what struck me as so powerful about what the resistance was about. Ultimately futile, why would you bother? It was we as humans with freedom and agency is what defines us as humans, and that had been their sense of denial.
So when you compare, I mean, not that anyone wants a league table or a ranking, but you look at the plight of people now. There are children who have been born and raised and then are now raising children who have been in temporary accommodation for decades. If the world, and we'll talk about the UN next, if the world can't come to grips with problems of such magnitude and such long-lasting, entrenched dimensions, how can we be optimistic about more recent crises and conflicts?
So in Dadaab camp, there are now 3 generations, northern Kenya, as you just described. And having been there, the general picture is that the rich world has said, because 84% of the world's displaced people are in the poorest countries, not really our problem. It's been this wash my hands of it. And we know that Australia, that is generous in resettlement, but there's only 10 countries that do it. When it comes to actual burden sharing of the refugee problem, comes in 48th in the world on gross national income. So we like to only point to a very small bit. The truth is, after the Second World War, there was more displaced people, and we said, we're going to fix this. We
also said we'll never let this happen again.
And we said that's what the UN Convention on Refugees was all about. And we remember, Robert will know his name, the member for Balaclava who went to Evian in 1938. White, I think his name was. He said, in Australia, when they gathered to say, what are we going to do about the Jews in Germany? We don't have a racial problem in Australia, we're not taking one. That monumental failure was what led to the UN Convention on Refugees, and yet here we are again. I believe we actually have both the resources and the imagination, if we can match it with the political will, to settle this. We did it once, we can do it again, but that comes back to leadership.
We'll come to leadership in a second. I still want to pause on the United Nations. And before we get to the UN generally, on the Middle East, your organisation was in the news and being, in fact, accused of improper conduct. Where's that investigation up to?
So the staff member is still detained, and it's now 2 years, Connie.
So remind us, it's your Middle Eastern...
Gazan officer.
Your
He's
Gazan
a Gazan
officer.
So he would come in and out to our Jerusalem office.
Accused of taking money that's supposed to be for aid and directing it to political and terrorist purposes.
That's right. And the charges were double the amount of money that World Vision had had for the last 10 years in Gaza. Connie, who you can talk to later, has handled this in depth. We haven't found any monies missing. We've had forensic audits. We are now doing plea bargaining, and in some ways this will be a Harvard ethics case one day, because he says, I did nothing and I won't just take a plea, even though he could get out. From our organisational point of view, because our program has been suspended in Gaza, and the Israeli government wants it active now again in Gaza. They know how desperate it is there. A plea would actually be quite useful, because you could go, okay.
But you're not going to toss him under a bus, surely?
That's why I mean about a Harvard's ethics case. No, we're not. So he's in the military tribunal system there. Palestinians don't ever do well. I forget the figures, but it's 99.8% are found guilty there. I shouldn't say this, but I've been watching the case of the Jewish principal from here.
Malka Leifer from Bet Rivka, yeah.
Who's been free for 5 years.
Under supposedly house arrest, but yes, free to move
on the
around.
West Bank, and and I think of our staff member, and the contrast is personally very painful for me. So that's where that case is up to.
All right, now let's go to the United Nations. Is it failing?
Yes, when you have now Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, that may well have used banned chemicals absolutely, and there hasn't been inspections, and how do you hold it to account? It's pretty hard to actually recognise an international system of justice. Back in, I'm sure you all were reading over the weekend Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars, but
Couldn't put it down, yeah.
There you have this problem that the United Nations have got. So was it the Spartans? I forget, went to the Milesians, they conquered them. They said, we can do this the hard way or the easy way. The Milesians said, this is unjust, how dare you, this is unfair. And the Spartans said, no, justice only exists between forces that are equal. Well, the whole of British jurisprudence and world vision is actually to say we don't believe in that sense of justice. The idea of the United Nations was, at least in theory, to say we don't believe in that source of justice. Kim Jong-un decided he does believe in it. If he had nuclear weapons, they would have to take him seriously. So we are seeing a failure at that level to say that there is that international rule of justice, which the United Nations and the Security Council need to actually recognise.
I always preferred the Etruscans myself. But what's happened to leadership? We talk often about it in the domestic sense globally. I mean, at the moment we've got Xi Jinping, who's decided he'll be basically a dictator and he'll purge any enemies in the name of rooting out corruption. I notice it's not his own corrupt princelings and family members who are being purged, it's only other people who are being purged. Putin is basically a dictator. Trump, I say no more. Look at what's going on. You mentioned Recep Erdogan in Turkey. We could rattle off the populist rise in the recent Italian election. Poland, Romania has gone the same way. Hungary, lots of other European democracies seem to be succumbing. So when we talk about leadership, we can sit on a stage at the Melbourne Convention Centre in comfortable bourgeois Melbourne and say, oh, tut, tut, tut. But the reality seems to be that it's all actually slipping away from our aspirations for a better world.
So I think one of the whiplashes of globalisation, and the truth is we can't undo it, and it's here and we all benefit from it, is what I call the retribalising going on. That whiplash is very severe, and that retreat and turning inwards is now seeing such leaders entrench messages of fear.
All around the world.
All around the world, and I'm sure Peter Dutton is a fan of Jack Nicholson and A Few Good Men. He's on the wall saying, you can't handle the truth, you sleep under the blanket of and rise under it of freedom that I provide, being on the wall. Those walls, that sense of it takes violence and it takes strength and we're protecting you, fear over and against globalisation's more optimistic sense that we can live together. We're seeing this profound whiplash. Where will it end? Will there be leaders able to name it and stand up to it? That's the question.
Are you an optimist?
Yeah, I'm an optimist by profession. I believe that optimism says whatever problems we have, there will be solutions. They may be painful. On climate change, I've known that the energy zone that has driven history is parents who will make the most unbelievable sacrifices just so their kids can have a better chance than them. Most of our parents did it. On climate change, the difficulty is they actually have to make sacrifices for the third and fourth generation of their kids. And that penny hasn't quite dropped. That generational challenge is why I find that one very, very challenging to think, can we restrict our standard of living? We all know the problem. We in the industrial West have said in terms of who owns the sky, we do. We put our carbon up there. We've had our advance in our lifestyles. Poor nations saying our turn to put it up, and we're going, hang on, you can't do that. Well, why don't you have a cost of living sacrifice? No, in a democracy you can't ever do that. So unless we can have that generational sense that it's not just our kids and their jobs, it's actually our grandkids, that one I'm not as optimistic on.
You hinted before at the personal toll that some of these inspections of refugee facilities takes on you, and you hinted that there's a bit of personal anguish and maybe even a bit of burnout. And then I noticed you very deliberately said that you're an optimist by profession. What do you do in your spare time? Are you a pessimist in your spare time?
Well, barracking for Essendon, yes.
Twice.
No, look, I think I am an optimist, not just by profession, but by nature. I've always believed that you can make a difference. My wife likes to say to me, the trouble with me is I won't burn out, but I'll burn everybody around me out. And part of that is that sense that I can still make a difference.
Young people seem to have and by young I mean, the next generation, maybe our kids' generation, seem to have a completely different relationship to these issues and almost an impatience at the baby boomers having, let's be frank, we've stuffed it up. We've made a bit of a mess of it, haven't we? And maybe we should say, okay, time for the levers to be yanked around by a new generation.
I forget which economist said it, but I say it to my kids. Your generation should be marching in the streets, even rioting. You and I, first floor of David Derham Law School, we didn't pay any fees.
Nope.
I remember my wife having a conversation with my daughter when she was at university, and I was, like men do, pretending to read the paper, but really eavesdropping. And my daughter said, Mum, how did you pay your way through uni? And my wife said, well, I didn't have fees. Ask your Uncle Peter about that. She said, yeah, but part-time work. How did you? My wife said, well, actually, I was training to be a teacher. I was on a studentship. I was not only paid to go to university. The 4 years of my degree came off the 10 years, so after 6 years I got long service leave. And I'll never forget my daughter just going, how easy was that? The extraordinary fact that our generation has been the highest spending, worst saving, highest consuming generation with all the perks in human history. I don't know why the next generation aren't organising and marching in the street. But I do think your point is we as a generation have to actually say we are going to need to pull back. We are going to need to not just vote with our hip pocket nerve. We've had it so good.
So what does a better Australia look like? Is there a template? Is there a blueprint?
Yeah, we did a survey called the Australia We Want Community Council for Australia, and it was remarkably resonant in terms of what Australians wanted. And I won't go into describing it all, but it was dealing with climate change and having a better feel about ourselves and refugees and being generous and having hope and teaching our kids that perspective is they are blessed. And then we started to mark out the steps on the way. The real challenge and the problem is that our leaders with a 3-year election cycle say, yeah, but that vision's 20 years' time, I'm running in 3 years' time. That short-termism is really failing us in democratic processes. But when you actually talk about the Australia you want, I find you get a remarkable consensus.
I'm going to make bookends of where Connie started, and I'm going to invite her to come back in a moment and she'll moderate the Q&A and make some of her own observations as well. But the bookend is Connie started with an acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people and a welcome to country. And the other end, do you think we can ever as a country ever achieve equilibrium and growth whilst we don't acknowledge the invasion of the continent, the failure to provide, the failure of treaties, plural, or any settlement the way every other colonised nation has done except us? And the bookends of a conversation here, to start with a welcome to country and finish with an acknowledgement that there's a gaping hole in the soul, the centre of the soul of Australia, that we simply just refuse to acknowledge. I don't know how we move on until we fix that.
Yeah, I think this is our original sin. I think this is the hole in our soul. And I absolutely believe, and I look at my life, your age, looking back, realising I never ever came to terms with the size, silence and spirituality of this continent that I live on. Unlike the people who actually have come to terms with that, and that has left me so impoverished. I have felt really gutted by the lack of movement. We have said to Indigenous, get your act together, tell us what you want, come back and then we'll be ready. Well, as I read it, they did that at Uluru, the statement from the heart. They did that. It was a consensus. It's the very thing we've been saying you do, and then we said, oh no, that's too difficult, that's not going to work. I have a personal sense of this because my aunt lived in Alice Springs and worked with Indigenous for 40 years, so at 17 I went up and I was struck by the size, silence, spirituality, otherness. It really profoundly affected me. Her deaconess in the Anglican Church, Sister Eileen Heath, had been at Magumba River when the girls from Rabbitproof Fence had escaped. She was there with A.O. Neville. And she lived to 102. I was going up to Jigalong, World Vision working there. I visited Sister Eileen. She said, Daisy's still alive. Give her my greetings. And I found Daisy, the only one of the three still alive, literally sitting in the red dust. I said, Sister Eileen sends her love. Daisy just started weeping. She started weeping and said she was the only kind one there at Magumba. Well, you know, this generational and family dimension of it means that what you just said, a very fine speech, absolutely, I agree with.
And your aunt is one of the great untold stories of Australian living memory history. In fact, it's a story you've just made me decide I'll fill that gap somehow, one way or the other. I take that challenge. It's been wonderful to be able to pick your brains, Tim, and I know Connie is going to say a few words, but even before she comes to the microphone, I want to thank you. We've covered vast territory. And my final question, to tie together the injustice to Indigenous Australians with Australia's blinkered approach to refugees, asylum seekers and foreign aid, they all involve the same mindset, do they not? They all involve that same mindset, which is until we acknowledge our common humanity and our obligations to each other, whoever we are, we're somewhat hampered in moving forward, are we not?
Absolutely, and this is where to be human is to have empathy, and out of empathy comes compassion. And I know one of your favourite people, joking, the current Pope, his encyclical Laudate Si, Caring for Our Home, actually says that mindset is compassion and our organic connection to the earth and to each other. That actually is the paradigm shift we've lost, we have to get back to.
Connie. Tim, thank you very much, and Connie will come up and moderate the Q&A. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you to John, as well as Tim, for a really deeply engaging discussion, everything about the hole in our soul here in Australia, the injustice that we've not faced, through to leadership, the political dynamic, the morals and ethics of our actions, through to is the international system broken. So thank you both for that. I've been asked to just share a few remarks as well on the basis of this conversation and my experience. And there's just a few little points that I'd sort of add into the mix of the conversation that we had, which is how do we know that Australians are generous and compassionate people. We've seen that again and again in certain circumstances and not in other. And I think John's challenge to the international development agencies to tell the story better, to get the cut through, that can break through that indifference is a really valid one and very strong. I think as well, let me share a couple of stories to get that cut through. I was responsible for World Vision's programs across 14 countries and across the Syria and Iraq conflict particularly, and basically I started the month before the anniversary is marked of this war in Syria and finished just 6 months ago. There's an inconsistency in the support that we give. So when people started flooding into Lebanon, which is not a wealthy country, there's now 1.5 million refugees, it's estimated. I think the official estimate's 1 million, but there's probably 1.5 million refugees in a country of 4 million people that's really just a slip of land, and they're dealing with that. The World Food Programme was providing funding, which was administered by agencies like World Vision and others, to communities, and it was cash, so they could go and buy what they needed because there was a local economy, but it was $30 per person when it started. And then after a year, the funding went down, and so my staff had to front communities and say, sorry, there's no money anymore, so we're not going to be giving you $30 a person. And Lebanon's an expensive economy. For all the members of your family, you're going to get $13.50 for the first 5 members of your family. That's an incredible thing for an aid worker to have to do, and it's an even worse thing for a person to sit and think about how they respond. When the refugees started flowing, people that we were working with were saying, we don't want to go, but we're frightened if we don't go now, it'll be too late, and we won't have anywhere to go except to sit here and die or be pushed back into a war zone to die. And that's the reality, and I think when people understand that, it changes that equation. If you respond to humanitarian needs, and there's 68 million people who've been forcibly displaced, one with consistency, there's dignity in that, but there's also self-interest in that, as well as the compassion of it stops this uncontrolled movement of people around the world. If we can address the issues in our international system and start acting as the global community where the conversation ended, we can do something about 68 million people pushed out of their homes and pushed on the road. And one of the things that I remember years ago studying when I was a student at La Trobe was, I think it was Garrett Harding, and he came out with something called lifeboat ethics. And I thought, that's never going to happen. And the basic idea was, if you're lucky enough to be in a country where you've got lots of resources, if other people still come, you have the right to say no, because you've got to make sure that lifeboat floats. But it's a very sad world if we start thinking about Australia as a lifeboat. And it's also a really strong image, a wrong image, because as we've seen, we're interconnected into this world and we can't protect ourselves from it by barriers. So even if we lack in compassion, our self-interest needs to drive us to do something quite different. One of the things I often say is that, you know, whenever this war in Syria was escalating, there was never an argument about, can we afford those weapons? You know, when, you know, different countries considered, will we go in? They never said, what's it going to cost us? Can we afford the weapons? There was always money for the weapons. But when it came to feeding people, to putting shelter over their heads, to protecting their children, to responding to a need for education, I have never seen people with such a desire for education, 9-year-olds saying to me, can we just have the courses acknowledged, because when we go back to Syria, I don't want to go back to grade 1. Such a demand. It doesn't cost much, but there's never enough money for that. I just want to pick up on a point that John made about where our compassion lies, and that it's all part of a similar dynamic. When people say, well, we can't afford to give money overseas, we've got poverty in Australia, I don't believe that those are the people who are making generous contributions to needs here. I don't believe it. And what I see is in parts of our community, because now that I'm with the Brotherhood, a discussion that comes down to on the economic values we apply, that some people don't have lives that are economically viable. And I think that's a really disturbing question and conclusion. It's at the heart of this issue about who we are in the world and who we are not. And just to wrap up, before I open for questions, I left one refugee camp, pouring rain, people are living under bits of plastic, hoardings, old things which are advertising Apple iPhone 6s coming out, and people are living under that with a blizzard coming in over the mountain. It's like -5 degrees, there's snow, it's a shocking environment, and we'd been there with the the head of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, he was UNHCR at the time and the head of Save the Children, meeting with the family, and we were explaining how there wasn't the money to keep this little school going. And as we left, one of the men came out with me. He'd been an engineer in Syria, and he said to my translator, "Is it true that last year $56 billion was spent in the United States on pets?" And I thought, that can't possibly be right. And I Googled it later, and it is. And the fact is, in Australia, that's probably true as well, that it is about priorities and the choices that we make. And what does it say to people that in other parts of the world in desperate need, that we prioritise our pets over the lives and the educational opportunities of their children? And that's what people see in the response that we give to them when we say we can't afford it. It is about priorities. So I do think we need to do more to build trust, but I really welcome this conversation about what does it say about our identity, who we are, and the deep moral and ethical questions that we're challenged by in thinking about what is Australia's role in the world, and how does that impact on our life here in Australia as well. So with those comments, let me open up for questions. We've got 2 roving mics around the room. The lights are being brought up so I can see people. There's a question over there. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and no speeches, short comments and questions, please.
Thank you. My name is Peter. This is to Tim. Earlier on you said that the overheads for giving to an organisation were important to you. In Geelong they had a community fund, if you like. There were no individual organisations. It all went into that community fund and then was doled out to various other places. Why isn't that done in Victoria with, say, World Vision, Red Cross, Plan, all of that? You get rid of all of those overheads and you can have a simulated, a better process.
So two comments. Firstly, the historical creation of most of the agencies all started in war. Oxfam with the Greek crisis, Save with German widows after the First World War, World Vision in Korea. And they developed international agencies, so they weren't just started here in Australia. So you have federations of countries where the structure is very complex to then just all collapse into one conglomerate agency. Secondly, people still want to give to organisations, brands that represent, even within the humanitarian field, particular dimensions of what they associate as really important. Where you've done just general merging of organisations, curiously, maybe counterintuitively, giving drops off. People go, I don't quite recognise it, I don't have a history, I don't understand it. Third point is, and this is the good news part of it, is that all these agencies that seem to be competing for the dollar here in Australia, I'm talking about overseas agencies, collaborate unbelievably well in the field. So whether it's Save or Oxfam or World Vision, we agree who's doing housing, who's doing water, who's doing the nutrition, and there is remarkable collaboration and remarkable flow of staff between our agencies. You'll find World Vision people now at Oxfam and Oxfam people at Save and all so on. So it may sound simple and neat to go, it'll just work a lot easier and be lower overheads if we just had one organisation. Actually, in reality, it doesn't quite work out that way.
Why don't you get a better message across by allowing that message that you're collaborating with all your overseas organisations to come across in your media presentation, so that it doesn't matter what organisation you give to, it's going to be effective?
Yeah. Look, I think that's a good challenge, and I think we should be doing that better. What Britain has is the DEC, Disaster Emergency Appeal. It started 40 years ago. And they will have the agencies all as part of it, and Joanna Lumley or someone fronting it, and that will be a very attractive appeal without all the branding going on. That hasn't happened in Australia for different reasons that I won't go into, or other countries, but it's not a bad model when you look at the UK.
And just while you're getting the microphone, a really quick anecdote. If you speak to any member of Parliament, there were 2 events simultaneously capturing Australia's imagination a few years ago. One was Four Corners showing footage filmed secretly inside an abattoir in Indonesia of Australian live export cows being mistreated. At the same time, a group of asylum seekers were washed onto the rocks at Christmas Island and smashed in a storm, most of them dying. Those 2 events took place on the same day. Ask any member of Parliament about the calls they got to their office that week for action, and they would have got 20 times the number of calls asking them to do something about live animal exports compared to people being smashed to death on the rocks at Christmas Island in a shipwreck.
My name's Max Costello, no relation, but hello, Tim. I'm going to very briefly put something that I put to John Faine in the presence of Julian Burnside QC 3 years ago, namely that all the detention centres are workplaces, and including the ones offshore, of course, or the one remaining, and they are therefore covered by the Work Health and Safety Act of the Commonwealth, which requires the operator to look after the health and safety of not only workers but also other persons, namely the detainees, the residents. My question, and prosecutions should have occurred for breaches of that act. So my first question is, did you know that the cruelty regime we talk about is in fact a massive set of criminal offences against an Australian law? And my second question, perhaps I could ask, is any member of the audience aware of this? Because I went to John Faine and said, can you raise it on your program? He said, Max, get yourself published in The Age and I will. I'm still trying.
Yeah, look, I think the cruelty is not just in the offshore processing, it's to the 30,000 plus who are here. And the interminable uncertainty and denial of dignity and rights. For what? For what? The thought that somehow all the boats are going to start up again when we know turn back, as harsh as that is, and we don't have much visibility about it, but it's actually been working. So I think this is just one of the most profound black stains in our history. I take your point.
And Max, as I said to you then, and I'll say again, and as Julian said to you also, it's an interesting theory, but it's not one that stands up when you apply the strict legal scrutiny that it requires to launch either a private or public prosecution. So that's why it hasn't happened, and that's why I said to you I can't run a story based on something that's legally pretty dodgy, and I couldn't do more coverage about refugees without people turning the show off saying, oh, for God's sake, he's banging on about it again and again and again. So from my point of view, I'm trying to do as much as I can without giving the shits to the audience who are caring about it, but not to the exclusion of everything else. It's a bit like a Greens campaign in Batman that only talks about Adani and clearly put as many people off as it turned on.
Don't take it personally, Max.
No, don't.
Faine's against all Costellos.
All Costellos.
All Costellos.
And for very good reasons.
Hello, my name's Deborah Blackmore. I have 2 questions that are overlapping. The first is directed to John as a representative of the Australian media and the responsibility that the media has in our country for the simplifying of what are very complex problems and how we go about potentially changing the discussion in our society so that we can actually start to engage more in how we are proactive in changing the direction of this gaping hole that we have in the soul of our country. Because following on from that is what is actually being discussed now about, or the direction that the political discussion is going from our government in terms of increased racism, increased lack of compassion that we see, the complete contradictions of not acknowledging that the majority of people who I met in Cox's Bazar were in fact farmers on the other side of the Naf River in Myanmar who have lost their farms, their livelihoods, their stock, their crops, their children, their family, but at the same time acknowledge that farmers who are white might be of more value. So for me, it's what role does the media play in actually having created the society we live in, and how do we use the media to actually start the conversation in a way that allows us to build hope? Because I'm telling you, I'm going out to try and make a difference, but every time I come home, the hole gets bigger when I see the discussion that's happening out there.
Sure. First of all, not for a moment do I pretend to represent the Australian media, which is as diverse as the Australian population and the audience in this room. And I may share technology with Today Tonight, but I don't share values with Today Tonight. And they would just as gleefully say, you're nothing to do with us either. So the Australian media is a bit of it doesn't exist. There are different Australian media talking to different parts of the community and in different ways. Your question contained more than 140 characters, so it clearly isn't suitable for the Twitter sphere. There's undoubtedly a shortening of collective attention spans, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. We can go into them, but at one level it's just not relevant. It doesn't matter why. The fact is it's happening. And so the challenge for organisations, whether it's the Brotherhood, whether it's World Vision, whether it's La Trobe University, whether it's your local panel beater or the butcher, the challenge is the same. How to tell your story, how to get people's attention, and how to persuade them of something, whether it's to do with foreign aid or whether it's to do with the virtues of your, boneless chicken steaks or whatever it might be. So there are challenges that we've never encountered before. Our world is rapidly reconstructing around us. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend to you that I have the answers, because everyone who does do that is a liar. And they usually are middle-aged men with ponytails, and no one should take any notice of middle-aged men with ponytails automatically, let alone Costellos. So there's no doubt that you've identified an enormous challenge in a world that is being redesigned rapidly in ways that we're not even that sure about. And a lot of the people who think they know what's going on don't. Rupert Murdoch didn't burn $400 million more and plus on MySpace because he just thought he'd throw away $423 million or whatever it was. They bought MySpace not knowing that Facebook was in development. And Facebook just wiped out MySpace, and so on for Second Life, and so on. There's any number of examples. Our world is going through a more rapid transformation than anyone's ever had to deal with before, and that poses challenges. And that's one of the things that I was kind of connecting on before. Younger people, digital natives, are much more adept and much more agile than a lot of the older people who are still in charge. And now this is a huge leap, but stay with me. Your Robert Doyle scenario is an example of the changing of the guard. So Doyle and Kennett and some of the supporters who were in shock at what happened in this city just in the last few months, which is one of the most tumultuous examples of the #MeToo phenomenon in the world. I mean, we're the laboratory on this. That is an example of culture in transition. And everyone's wrestling with it now. Personally, I think it's long overdue. There are other people whose worlds are threatened by that, who say it's disastrous. I think they're dinosaurs. They think they're quite rightly the people who have been in charge because they know how to do this shit best. But that's what's happening in that sphere, and it's exactly the same across the board. It's a time of enormous excitement, but enormous challenges too.
Can I just pay tribute to Deb? I met her in Cox's Bazar and working with the Red Cross, one of those sorts of Australians, and there's many of them, who absolutely walk their talk. So thanks for your question, Deb.
Hooray to you.
So yeah, my name is Alistair Chisholm. It's a question for Tim. So I'm a designer and a student of business masters in entrepreneurship and innovation, and I find myself increasingly impressed at the role of entrepreneurship and in particular young entrepreneurs, and also social entrepreneurship and the role of NGOs and not-for-profits. And I think it's kind of amazing to me that these organisations can get off the ground and continue running. And so a lot of what you're talking about with World Vision is, where does the money come from? And it's always an equation of money in and money out, and what do you do with it? I guess my question is, what do you see is the role of entrepreneurship in tackling some of these big issue problems? And in particular, of late, I've been interested in business model innovation, and I'm wondering what World Vision perhaps is doing in terms of looking at their own business model and innovating to fix some of these issues.
Yeah, no, great question. So World Vision's taking social business, social entrepreneurship very seriously. And our model was always a hand up, not a handout. It was a model of saying, the money's going to stop, we're going to leave. It'll be 15 years maximum. So creating businesses is absolutely fundamental to wherever we're doing development. One of the most important dimensions of that, interestingly, I think that we do is called citizens' voice in action. So we won't do a program without saying, you're a citizen, you have a voice. Why do you need World Vision to build this health centre? Who should build it? Well, it should be our government. We say, well, you don't need World Vision then. And they go, who knows where the health budget's gone? Weapons, palaces, Swiss bank accounts. We go, okay, we'll help you build it, but here's the deal. You have to form a citizens' voice in action group, and we're going to train you to track the money that was in the health budget, to organise to get rid of the corruption or where it's hemorrhaging, to then be in a position, whether it's just government money or your own money, to take control because you know we are leaving. This is impossible if it's just a welfare tap kept on. So we're very committed to it. Look, having a son who started a charity, YGAP, that's into social entrepreneurship. Some of you might have been to Feast of Merit, a restaurant he and his mates started. It is hard to actually do the visionary charitable stuff and run a business at the same time. It sounds like the answer, but it is really difficult, hard work. And there's a reason why we've had boundaries between for-profit and not-for-profit. I say, why do we call ourselves not-for-profit? As if profit's bad. We're for purpose. And the purpose is actually lifting people out of poverty and hopefully making them sustainable and making some profit. But I do think it is hard. I'm up for it. I applaud it, but it's not a magic bullet. We once thought that microfinance was the magic bullet. There's any number of failed microfinance stories around the world now. Whenever we think there's one magic bullet, apart from empowering women, I still think that's the closest we've got to a magic bullet, but social business is in the mix, and it should be.
Can I just add something to that? I was part of a meeting which looked at, for humanitarian, how do we get investment capital? Because most of the communities where we work with refugees, it's extraordinary the things that people will get up to. And I have this one image in my head of this refugee camp in Jordan, Azaz, which is out in the middle of nowhere. You can't see a tree for miles, it's just desert. And we've plonked little Bunnings-like sheds there, and that's where people live, not we, but the UNHCR. And this one gentleman that we went to visit his family, and he had collected water, the salty water, he'd filtered the water out, he made himself a little garden, and he was growing a garden there. And you see that again and again. You know, we use terms like social entrepreneurship. I use the term resilience, because that's when people do what they can with what they have. But this meeting was interesting. It was Boston Consulting Group, it was the World Bank, it was myself as a representative of World Vision, some smaller refugee organisations, Leave a Kitchen, and some American philanthropists looking at how can we mobilise capital so that we can invest in forcibly displaced populations, so they're not just trying to do whatever they can with their own resources, which are next to nothing, but actually bring some other resources in there. So there's some great ideas around, but it's how do you break down some of the barriers that founders on, the kind of nationalism and barriers that the governments put up to enable, to allow refugees to work. Other questions? Over here? If you say your name, thank you.
Hello, my name's Jenny. I was just thinking about, we have leaders who are very entitled materially, and they want to maintain resources for their countries, their people and themselves. Revolution is, coup d'etat has probably not the answer. I don't know a lot, but I know about genocides through specific major revolutions in the world. So it seems not the way to go, that revolution is probably best slowly approached through education. So it's not the answer to immediate problems with refugees moving around the planet in terror. But perhaps if we send peace workers into many, many countries, educating people on the ground to divest themselves of, I know there are many who are desperate for need and need basic needs, so obviously they won't be divesting themselves, but people who are entitled need to divest themselves of some of their major material needs. You know, huge houses with, you know, all the mod cons. Let's be more modest, you know, let's think about the social wage. Let's think about being a little bit less selfish. And I think the only way we can do that is to educate many, many young people to think about the collision course we're on.
Thank you. Would you like to?
Yeah, let me just say, look, I believe in education. I think that's really important. But I always say, follow the money and who sets the rules. There's only arguably one Christian doctrine that has empirical evidence, and that's the doctrine of original sin. The idea that self-interest will always prevail. And the incentives with the money, when you started with coup d'etats, it made me think of Kabila, who's president in the Congo at the moment. His father said, it's really easy to have a coup d'etat when he first marched into the Congo. You just need a satellite phone, a few soldiers. You actually, on the satellite phone, do some deals with American or other corporations that I'll give you a concession for this license, and they give you $1 million, you buy more mercenaries, you keep marching toward the capital, and that's how he had his coup d'etat. In other words, the incentives around the money and around the powerful interests are often as important as educating. People, you know, have an instinct of what's right, but the self-interest, given particular incentives, really has to be always made visible.
Time for one last quick question.
Hi, my name's Julia Barron. I actually work at the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, so my question is really directed at Connie and Tim. Tim, you were talking before around sort of younger generations leading a bit more and having, I guess, more decision-making power, and potentially the need for older generations to step back to allow us or support us to do that. So my question is, in both your roles as leaders of your respective organisations, Are you doing anything to support young people and give them real decision-making power in, I guess, like the programs and policies and systems that are designed to be for us and work for us? And if not, how high a priority is it?
What a shame, we're out of time, I think. Do you want to go first, Connie?
Yes. Look, I've been in the job, this is my 9th week, so it's very early in the job, but my view is that we have no future if we don't engage young people in our organisation. As, you know, John was saying, they're the digital natives, you are the digital natives, and the future is yours, and we need to bring together a real diversity, and we do need to do that at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. We have a lot of really great people, but we've got a structure that doesn't represent that diversity at the senior levels, that's for sure. And stay tuned, next week there will be announcements about changes and new strategies, but let me leave it at that.
Look, I'd just say for myself, one of the reasons I stepped down as CEO was to say this stage of my life needs to be mentoring and getting out of the way, and I'm got a clear program in my head of who I'm mentoring with and who I've taken on to do that. You know, at our stage of life, I'm talking about John and
Thanks.
And John. You spend a lot of your life building the container, which is, you know, the career and the achievements, and then at this stage of life, you actually go, I'll look into the container and see what's in there. And it is that moment of going, yeah, there's a persona out there, and all a persona is, I think, is the Greek word for a mask. There's a whole lot of things that are masks, and I think the mentoring stage is saying, take off the mask and invest in the younger ones. So I hear you.
And for my 2 bobs worth, even though you didn't ask me, I noticed. Julia, thank you. I tried to resign last year. I've never said this publicly before. And I said to the ABC, I'll finish up at Christmas. And they said, no, you won't. And I said, then in that case, we need to have a plan, because I don't want to do this forever. And we came to an understanding of succession planning, and I'm doing in my workplace exactly the same thing. I'm putting enormous amounts of effort into creating fights to the death amongst the next generation over who gets my gig. No, more seriously, I'm acutely aware of the need, and I sincerely believe in the need, not just for younger people, but people who are much more diverse. And the ABC on radio and television is too old, too male and too white. And we're doing everything we can to change that, even though it's painful.
Thank you. A Better Australia, the case for compassion and hope looking outward. But what a piece of hope it is when on a Monday night a couple of hundred people will turn out to take part of this great conversation, which has ranged really broadly about who Australia is individually, who are we as Australians, what's the culture that we want for ourselves, what are the values that we want to project into our community and our world, and into analysing some of the bigger issues as well. Around international community, whether it's broken, the international architecture we have. But what a remarkable conversation we've had, the first in the 2018 series. Please keep tuned in and keep turning up for these timely conversations about a better Australia. The next 2 sessions will be one with Gillian Triggs, obviously looking at the human rights record, and the next one with Tim Flannery, looking at some of the issues around our environment and climate change. So other big conversations about our life here in this country. And I think the way in which we can conceive of this usefully, if I take an international perspective, Australia signed on with the rest of the international community to the Sustainable Development Goals. And those goals relate to us as much as they do to any other country in the world, and it's about justice for people and planet. And so these conversations will lead us with other significant and respected voices into those further conversations that are joined up. So please allow me to thank Professor Robert Mann and the La Trobe University team for putting the program together tonight and all the work that they've done in putting this together, and to once again thank Tim Costello and John Faine for allowing us to eavesdrop and participate in their conversation.
And thank you to Connie.